Tonight we drift back through the wintry fog of history, into a London that once knew a holiday season unlike any other. Not the glittering gaslit streets we imagine today, but a city wrapped in shadow, its lamps dimmed, its windows dark, its people waiting for Christmas lights that never came. The year was 1877, and as a bitter cold crept over the Thames, something strange unfolded, something that would leave the city hushed, unsettled, and forever marked by a Christmas unlike any before it. A Christmas where light itself seemed to vanish. Before we descend into those mist-covered alleys and quiet drawing rooms, before we step into the stories of the lantern keepers, the railway guards, and the families who waited for a glow that never arrived, I'd like to welcome you wherever you are listening from, to all of you in the US, the UK, and Europe, to viewers across Asia, Australia, Africa, and every other corner of the world. I'm grateful you're here tonight. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it for you right now? If you enjoy these long atmospheric sleep stories, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. It truly helps the channel, and it means I can continue creating restful journeys like this one. Now before we begin, get yourself comfortable, adjust your pillows, let your hands rest softly. Allow your breathing to settle into a slow, steady rhythm. If you'd like, dim your own lights. Let the room grow just a bit softer, a bit quieter, so that the world of 1877 can rise gently around you. When you are ready, let the darkness of old London unfold. Let the story gather you like a winter cloak, and follow me into a night when even Christmas seemed to lose its glow. London in the winter of 1877 carried a kind of cold that crept slowly through everything, through chimney stacks, through horse carriage seams, through wool coats pulled tight against trembling chests. But on this night, the glow was wrong. It began subtly, so subtle that only those accustomed to walking the streets at dusk noticed it first. The lamplighters, moving from post to post with their long poles and quick practiced strikes, found the flames sputtering in ways they shouldn't. The lamps flickered, dimmed, and in some cases refused to catch at all. Shopkeepers stepped outside, rubbing their arms against the cold, watching as their festive window displays, usually sparkling with polished brass toys, sugared fruits, and paper garlands, fell strangely dull without the familiar illumination. Even the snowflakes drifting down looked gray, as though the darkness itself had seeped into them. Across the city, families preparing for the holiday noticed it too. Candles burned low, lanterns hissed weakly, and fireplaces crackled with an odd muted glow, as though the flames themselves had grown tired. The river was often called the lifeblood of London, but on this dim December evening, it looked more like a sleeping beast. The Thames drifted in slow, heavy currents, thickened by cold, smudged with fog, and carrying an eerie quiet that felt heavier than the water itself. Barge workers, usually accustomed to shouts echoing across the docks, found themselves lowering their voices without quite knowing why. The quiet wasn't peaceful tonight. No, it was observant, as though the city itself were listening. The lamps along the embankment, struggling against the creeping darkness, cast only faint halos that glimmered briefly on the water before disappearing into the mist. A few fishermen, stubborn enough to remain on the piers, stared uneasily at the dim glow reflecting on their lines. Even their lanterns seemed weaker, their flames trembling as if chilled. It was near Blackfriars Bridge where the first whispers began. And then there was the old man, Captain Reeve, retired river pilot, who leaned heavily on the railing near the pier with his coat buttoned to his chin. He was a man who had seen storms, wrecks, surges, and floods, and yet even he felt unsettled. He watched the lamps flicker, the ones he'd trusted to guide him for decades, and muttered to himself, "Light doesn't vanish like that unless it's being swallowed." His breath curled into the air like a ghostly ribbon, twisting away before dissolving into the night. Others noticed him watching, noticed his unease, and felt it echo within them. For along the Thames on nights like this, superstition had a way of finding its voice. One child, clutching her mother's gloved hand, whispered, "Mom, is the river taking the lights?" And though her mother smiled softly, brushing back her daughter's bonnet, she didn't offer an answer because she didn't have one. Above them, the bells of St. Paul's tolled gently, the sound carrying over the river in slow, mournful waves. Even the chimes felt dim tonight, softer than usual, as though the darkness dulled the sound. London did not yet know it, but this was only the beginning. Something deeper than fog, older than cold, was stirring quietly, patiently, just beneath the surface of the city. And the Thames, always the first to sense change, had already begun to whisper its warning. In the maze of London's narrow streets, where stone walls leaned close like old friends sharing secrets, a lone lamplighter made his rounds. His name was Edwin Marlowe, a man whose life had been measured by the steady rhythm of flame. Every evening for nearly 20 years, he had walked the same cobbled routes, raised the same long brass pole, and awakened the city's lamps one by one. But tonight, even Edwin, practical, unsettled Edwin, felt something tighten in his chest. The pole quivered in his glove as he set the tip against the next lamp's ignition lever. With a practiced flick, he coaxed the spark inside. And for a moment, the flame sprang to life, soft and hopeful. Then, as if exhaling its final breath, it thinned, flickered, and shrank to a dull orange bead barely visible through the frosted glass. Edwin frowned, stepping closer. "Not you as well," he muttered, his voice low enough to be swallowed by the wind. He checked the valve, adjusted the wick, even tapped the metal frame with his knuckles. The small rituals he trusted when lamps misbehaved, but nothing worked. Instead, the flames seemed to resist him, trembling as though afraid to burn. A carriage rattled past, its wheels crunching over patches of ice. The coachman leaned out, calling down, "Evening, Marlowe." Light out again. Edwin nodded, though he didn't turn. They're going dim all over. Doesn't feel natural. The coachman shrugged and whipped the reins, but Edwin noticed the man's eyes linger a moment too long on the weakening glow. He'd seen it too. As the night deepened, Edwin continued his route. His footsteps echoed through alleys cloaked in shadow, past shuttered bakeries and quiet taverns whose windows glowed faintly with struggling firelight. He lit lamp after lamp, but the pattern repeated, each one flaring briefly before retreating into that same exhausted dimness. It was like watching a row of candles melt in reverse. The fog grew denser, brushing against Edwin's coat in cool, feathery strokes. He paused beneath an archway and listened. The city had fallen strangely mute. No distant laughter from pubs, no chiming of shop bells. Even the horses' hoof-beats had softened into something muffled and uncertain. Only the faint hiss of the lamps remained, soft, fading, fragile. Edwin looked down the stretch of street, yet unlit, the lamps standing like silent sentinels, awaiting their turn. For the first time in years, he felt a tremor of doubt. London depends on us, he whispered to himself, on the light. But tonight the light wasn't cooperating. Tonight, something unseen moved around him, subtle as breath, heavy as dread. Nudging its way between the lamps, dampening their glow. Edwin tightened his grip on the lamplighter's pole, a thin ribbon of resolve running through him. Parlors that should have shimmered with warmth instead flickered weakly, their corners dissolving into deep shadow. In a modest townhouse on Kendish Lane, the Harrow family gathered around their dining table. Her voice was small but hopeful, like a winter robin looking for crumbs. Mrs. Harrow hesitated. Their street always arranged a festive display. Ribbons, garlands, and dozens of lanterns strung from post to post. It was a tradition older than Clara, older even than Mr. Harrow's service in the city council. But tonight, as she looked toward the curtained windows, where only a sliver of faint lamplight seeped through, she could not bring herself to promise. "Of course, my dear," she said softly. "But perhaps a bit later this year, across the city, inside grand manors and humble rowases alike, similar scenes unfolded." At a wealthy estate in Kensington, a footman hurried to light fresh candles for a dinner party, only to find that the new tapers burned no brighter than the old ones. Guests murmured among themselves, glancing at the dim chandeliers overhead. In a cramped room above a bakery, a seamstress stitched by lantern light, blinking hard to see her thread. Each tug of the needle felt slower, heavier, as if the light itself resisted her efforts. And in countless homes, Families huddled together on sofas, blankets drawn up, speaking in hushed tones. No one wanted to admit fear during a season meant for joy. But fear had a way of settling in quietly, planting itself like a seed in the mind. Children clutched dolls, parents exchanged uncertain looks, and everyone found themselves glancing toward the windows more often than usual, searching for the comforting glow of street lanterns. But outside only the darkness pressed back. Still within these flickering parlors, small acts of courage bloomed. A mother reading softly to calm her child. A father adding extra cold to a reluctant fire. Neighbors checking on one another, offering bread, blankets, or simple company. The light may have been fading, but the people of London held tightly to whatever warmth they could muster. Little did they know that this night's dimming was merely the first whisper of a deeper stillness still to come. Fleet Street was usually a place of motion and noise, even well into the night. Printers hammering out the latest broadsheets, newsboys calling headlines across the pavements, horses clattering past the newspaper offices. "Never seen the foggy light like that," muttered old Jasper Briggs, who'd been working Fleet Street since before half the others were born. A younger editor, Miss Lyall, leaned closer to the glass. Her breath left a small circle of warmth against the cold pane. "It looks as if the air itself is swallowing it," she whispered. Beyond the window, the silhouette of a lamp-post wavered like a dying candle. A passing carriage emerged from the fog only to disappear again without a trace. No sound, no light, just a momentary phantom drifting between worlds. Inside the printing press hummed in a slower, heavier rhythm. Each rotation seemed reluctant, as though the machinery itself felt the weight of the darkness outside. A few workers complained that the lamps over their works had dimmed to the color of oversteeped tea. "Can't run the morning edition like this," one of them grumbled. "Ink's drying wrong, and I can barely see my own hand." Miss Lyall returned to her desk, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The building felt colder than usual. A draft slipped through the floorboards, curling around her ankles. She lowered her gaze to her notes, but the words blurred together, shadows pooling at the edges of the page. Farther down Fleet Street, at a small pie shop that usually stayed open for tired printers. The owner lit 3 new candles, but their flames rose barely higher than a match. Customers came and went with worried expressions, clutching warm pastries to their chests, as though the heat might chase away the creeping chill. Some wondered aloud if the gas lines had been compromised. A quiet corridor of flickering light and drifting shadows. And all the while, the fog moved with purpose, swirling in slow, silent patterns, as if it were waiting for something. But on this strange December evening, the gasworks felt unnervingly still. Inside the main processing hall, the echo of footsteps carried eerily, each sound stretching into the silence as though the building itself were listening. They're all showing normal levels, but the flame quality's dropping across the whole system. It's like the gas doesn't want to burn. Arthur exchanged a long look with his men. Gas didn't simply decide to behave differently. It obeyed pressure, temperature, chemical rules, and yet tonight those rules felt distant and fragile. He motioned for the workers to follow as he crossed to a row of brass gauges mounted on a long tiled wall. Each needle trembled softly, but strangely none dipped into the danger zone. Nothing was blocked, nothing was leaking, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Her home, though humble, was filled with small wonders, curiosities collected by her late husband during his years as a traveling merchant. Carved wooden birds, delicate glass vials, maps with curling corners, and tiny clocks whose soft ticks filled the room like distant raindrops. But tonight her attention rested on a peculiar item perched upon a shelf near the fireplace. A black forest weatherhouse, a quaint wooden structure decorated with painted pine trees and miniature carved figures. One figure, a woman, stepped out when the weather promised fair skies. The other, a man holding a cane, appeared when storms approached. For 30 years the weatherhouse had been reliable, honest, predictable. But tonight both figures stood outside their little home. Both Mrs. Thorne blinked at the sight, leaning closer. The tiny painted faces gazed outward as though expecting something or dreading it. She tapped the wooden base gently. Nothing changed. The two figures stood unmoving side by side, sharing a space they had never before occupied at the same time. She shielded it with her palm, but the light still trembled, weak and thin. Taking a slow breath, she rose and moved toward the window. Something was happening, something London had not experienced before. She returned to the Weather House. Mrs. Thorne pressed her hand against her heart. "Whatever this is," she murmured, "it came upon us quietly, and it means to stay a while." The sound barely carried through the dim parlor. Mrs. Thorne blew out the candle, though its weak flame needed little encouragement to die. London's lights were dimming, and its oldest signs, its quietest omens, whispered that a deeper darkness was unfolding. Once part of London's medieval defences, its archway now served little more than a symbolic boundary, a reminder of the city's ancient past. His name was Thomas Breen, a man with steady hands and a patient heart. He was accustomed to long nights spent listening to the soft rustle of wind through the bare winter branches to the distant clatter of carriages, approaching from the countryside, and to the comfort of the single sturdy lantern that hung beside his little guard-house. But tonight, as midnight crept slowly through the fog, Thomas noticed something he had never seen before. His lantern, one he had cleaned, refilled, and trimmed just hours earlier, was dimming. At first he assumed it was the cold. He lifted the lantern by its brass ring, turning it gently from side to side. Thomas frowned, adjusting the wick, but even as he raised it, the flame offered no increase in brightness. If anything, it pulsed more weakly. He stepped outside the guardhouse, boots crunching softly in the frost. The fog curling along the ground had grown thick, weaving through the grass in pale ribbons that moved with a strange, almost deliberate grace. Tiny, warm glimmers marking familiar homes. But tonight the horizon was empty, flat, black, as if someone had brushed a dark cloth over the world. He lifted the lantern higher, testing its reach. The light barely extended an arm's length. "That's not right," he muttered, his breath blooming into the air. He moved toward the ancient archway. The old stones were cold beneath his fingertips, colder than frost alone could produce, as though the night itself had seeped into them. Thomas had grown up hearing stories of the North Gate, tales about wandering spirits, forgotten travelers who passed through long after the city had grown beyond its borders. But those were just stories, weren't they? Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a hollow, distant thud echoing from somewhere beyond the gate. Not loud, not urgent, but distinct, as though something had struck the earth miles away. Thomas stiffened, listening. Another thud, then stillness. He strained his eyes against the fog, leaning forward slightly. The lantern flickered in his hand, and for a brief moment the flame flared brighter, as though startled, before dying down again into its soft, trembling glow. Behind him, the guardhouse clock clicked past midnight, the metal gears winding in a slow, sleepy churn. Inside, the faint glow of a few half-hearted candles struggled against the heavy dusk that pressed in through the stained glass windows. "Are we still singing tonight?" Father Elias turned toward them, his expression gentle but troubled. He wanted to say yes. Father Elias set the baton gently on the altar. "It may be best to wait until tomorrow," he said quietly. "Your voices should not strain against whatever this is." The children nodded. Gathering their belongings, their footsteps echoed softly as they left the chapel, their lanterns glowing faintly like small wandering stars in the mist. Father Elias remained behind for a moment, gazing up at the dimmed, stained glass. The message inside was brief, just a few lines. But whatever he read struck him deeply, enough that he pushed back from the desk as if the paper itself radiated cold. A gust of air seeped through the window, causing the lamps to flicker. The darkness is no accident. Then the lamps dimmed further, and the room sank into deeper shadow. Outside, Henry continued down the street, unaware of the tremor he had just delivered into London's already fading night. To the east of London, the iron bridge of Millwright's Crossing arched gracefully over a narrow stretch of the Thames, its steel ribs glinting faintly beneath the dimming lamps. Normally, the bridge carried a gentle flow of foot traffic even at night. Bakers returning from evening deliveries, night shift workers heading home, and couples strolling slowly beneath the lamp's warm glow. But tonight the bridge was almost empty. A low wind drifted over the water, sharp enough to sting the skin. As he approached, the faint lantern light revealed the outline of a street sweeper's broom propped against the railing. But there was no street sweeper, no footsteps, no cart. Just the broom left upright, as though abandoned in a hurry. Harold scanned the fog. "Hello, anyone there?" His voice carried only a few paces before fading entirely. No answer. He knelt, touching the broom handle. The wood was cold again, colder than it should have been. A damp chill ran up his spine. Something had unsettled the street sweeper enough to leave mid-task. He stood slowly and looked around the bridge once more. The fog drifted eerily thick but strangely uniform, as though it moved with intention, curling and settling in careful patterns. Then he heard it, a faint metallic groan vibrating through the iron beneath his feet. At first it sounded like the normal settling of metal in winter, but then it repeated longer, lower, resonating deep through the beams. Harold placed a hand against the railing again. The metal felt like it was breathing. The warmth was there barely, but it felt distant, like heat remembered rather than felt, as if the flames were struggling to do what they had always done effortlessly. Across the building, doors opened and voices filtered through the narrow hallway. The fire won't take. My coals are hardly glowing. Is the chimney blocked? Even the kettle won't boil proper. In the room above, an elderly man named Mr. Hale stirred his stew over the hearth, brow furrowed as the pot continued to simmer weakly, without ever truly bubbling. He muttered old stories under his breath, tales he hadn't spoken of since childhood in the countryside. Stories about winters where light itself grew weary. On the ground floor, two sisters sat with shawls over their shoulders, rubbing their arms as a thin draught slipped beneath the door. Their fire flickered in soft blue tones, unnatural, ghost-like. Shivering residents drifted toward the building's shared stairwell, exchanging anxious glances. The muffled grumble of voices rose, though quietly. No one wanted to alarm the children. Then, from the opposite end of the hall, the caretaker of Whittleby House, Mrs. Hemsby, stepped out with a thick candle in hand. Its flame was no brighter than a fading star. She cleared her throat. "Everyone," she said gently, but firmly, "it's best we keep our doors closed tonight. Stay together. The fires are acting queer, but we'll manage. I'll check the chimneys come morning." But her eyes betrayed her worry. She had lived in East Sheep her whole life. She had tended to fireplaces since she was a girl, and never, not once, had she seen flames behave like this. The residents slowly retreated into their rooms. Doors closed softly, blankets rustled, fires crackled weakly as if protesting the strange night. And high above Whittleby House, the chimney tops released thin ribbons of smoke that drifted straight downward, not up, caught in the heavy, unnatural fog. Across the city, hearths continued their quiet struggle, each flame flickering in muted protest against the darkness. Tonight, even fire, the oldest friend of humankind, seemed subdued by whatever shadow had settled over London. In the winding alleys of Clerkenwell, where artisans and tradesmen worked in narrow shops packed tightly together, one dim light still struggled through the fog. It belonged to Mr. Edwin Bartleby, a master clockmaker whose reputation for precision stretched across half the city. His shop was usually a sanctuary of steady comfort, filled with the gentle ticking of clocks, the soft whir of gears, and the faint scent of oiled brass. Tonight, however, that comforting symphony faltered. Inside the cramped workshop, over a dozen clocks lined the walls. Tall case clocks, small mantel clocks, pocket watches in velvet boxes, all usually beat in perfect rhythm. But now the ticks were uneven. Some clocks slowed to a lazy drag, others stuttered like breaths caught in the throat. A few stopped entirely, their hands freezing as if time itself had hesitated. Mr. Bartleby stood at his workbench, pink snake glasses perched low on his nose, studying the innards of a half-assembled timepiece. The small lamp above his bench flickered faintly, its flame drooping toward the wick. "This is nonsense," he murmured. "The mainspring is sound, the gear ratio perfect. And yet," he tapped the casing gently. The watch gave a faint, reluctant tick, then fell silent again. As he leaned back, the low candle beside him wavered weakly, casting an unsteady glow across the cluttered room. Shadows shifted along the shelves like restless thoughts. He moved to the centerpiece of his shop, a magnificent long-gaze clock he had spent months restoring. Made of dark walnut, polished to a warm sheen, It usually filled the workshop with its calming, resonant chime. Now its pendulum swung slower than it should, much slower, as if pushing through thickened air. Mr. Bartleby pressed his ear gently to the wooden casing. The faint heartbeat of the mechanism, sharp, precise, dependable, had become irregular. Tick, tick, tick. He stepped back, alarm pricking at him. This clock had survived a century without issue. He had never heard it stumble. The door to his shop creaked open, letting in a wave of cold fog. A customer, Mrs. Crowell, bundled in a fur stole, entered with a broken carriage clock in her hands. "Oh, Mr. Bartleby," she said, brushing frost from her sleeves. "I hope you might," but she stopped. Her eyes widened at the sight of the workshop. "Why your clocks? They sound dreadfully ill." Mr. Bartleby offered a weak smile. "It appears," he said, adjusting his glasses, "that time itself is out of sorts this evening." Mrs. Prowl stepped carefully between the works, glancing nervously at the dim lamps and staggering tick of the clocks. "Is it the cold?" she asked softly. "No," he replied quietly. "Cold, I can manage. Mechanisms I can repair. But this," he gestured around them. "But this feels as though something has settled into the gears, something weighty." A long case clock at the far end of the shop gave a strained groan, then wound down with a soft, defeated sigh, its pendulum stilled completely. Mrs. C.R. clutched her carriage clock. "Oh dear," she whispered. As if in response, the candle on Mr. Bartleby's workbench gutted. Its flame thinned into a fragile thread, then steadied, though barely. The two stood quietly in the workshop's dim hush. All around them clocks ticked unevenly, their once reliable rhythm fractured. Mr. Bartleby placed a gentle hand atop the long case clock, almost in comfort. "Something has changed in London tonight," he murmured. "Something that touches not only flame and light, but even the beating of time." Outside the fog thickened, pressing against the small shop window with a strange velvety stillness. Tonight London wasn't merely growing darker. It felt as if the very hours themselves were growing heavy. Charing Cross, usually pulsing with movement even in the late hours, lay unusually still beneath the soft drape of London's thickening fog. Its grand buildings, once lit by bright lamps along the bustling thoroughfares, stood like sleepwalking giants, their windows dim and their silhouettes softened into the night. Constable James Hollowell, a tall man with a calm disposition, walked his usual patrol route, though tonight every step felt as though it carried him deeper into a quiet dream. His boots tapped the pavement gently, muffled by a fog so dense it seemed to sip up sound. At his side, his patrol lantern flickered with an unsteady glow. The flame had already shrunk twice since he'd left the station, no matter how often he trimmed the wick. Even the reinforced glass surrounding it felt strangely cold, as if it were drawing warmth away rather than containing it. He paused beneath the statue of King Charles II, its familiar silhouette barely visible. Normally, 4 bright lamps illuminated the base, creating a reassuring halo. Tonight, each lamp offered only a faint whisper of light, no stronger than embers, at the end of a long night. James lifted his lantern toward the statue, squinting. The fog swallowed the flame's brightness almost instantly. "Odd sight," this came a voice from behind him. James startled slightly, turning to see Mr. Allerton, the elderly night steward of the Charing Cross post office. Wrapped in a thick overcoat, the man leaned heavily on his cane, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Evening, Mr. Allerton," James greeted. "Didn't expect you out this late." The old steward nodded toward the weak glow of the nearby street lamps. "Went to check on the postal wagons. but the lamps, I swear they dimmed the moment I stepped outside. James nodded grimly. It's all over London. Something's wrong with the gas lines, or something else. Fires won't burn proper. Clockmaker in Clockenwell says the clocks are misbehaving too. Mr. Alayton's brows lifted. Clocks, oh dear. Sounds like the city's gone peculiar. The two stood in silence for a moment, watching as a horse-drawn, hansom cab approached slowly through the haze. Its driver held a lantern aloft, but the glow illuminated almost nothing, just the faintest shimmer on the horse's mane. The animal snorted uneasily, hooves striking the cobblestones with nervous taps. When the cab drew close, the driver leaned out. "Constable, apologies, but the lamps of the cab went near dead, nearly collided with the curb twice. Any idea what's happening?" James shook his head. "Not yet, but you're not the first to mention it." The driver muttered a thanks and continued on his way, disappearing back into the fog like a shadow swallowed whole. A sudden gust of cold air curled around James's legs, sharp enough to sting. His lantern flickered violently, shrinking into a thin bead of gold that trembled like it was about to die out entirely. He shielded it with his palm. Mr. Alaton's voice dropped to a whisper. "Feels like the darkness has weight tonight." James didn't answer immediately. He scanned Charing Cross Square, the benches, the silent shop fronts, the empty pavements, and felt something deep in his chest. A heaviness that didn't belong to fear exactly, but to recognition. He had seen nights of heavy fog before, storms, gas outages, winter chills, but he had never seen darkness behave as though it had purpose. "Head back inside, Mr. Alaton," James said quietly. "Something's settling over the city, and I'd rather you were warm indoors." The steward nodded and shuffled away, his cane tapping faintly until the fog swallowed him up. James lifted his lantern again and continued his patrol. The darkness swirled gently at the edges of the light, soft, patient, almost curious. And for the first time in his years of service, he felt London was watching him back, high above the winding streets of Bloomsbury, where townhouses huddled shoulder to shoulder like companions against the cold. An attic window flickered with the faintest glow. The light was weak, barely a breath of gold, but enough to reveal the silhouette of a man bent intently over a canvas. His name was Julian Grantham, a young painter known for capturing London's winter streets in soft, delicate strokes. But tonight his brush moved slower, as though the paint itself resisted the cold. The attic was his sanctuary, quiet, tucked beneath a slanted roof, with a large window overlooking the rooftops. On clear nights, he could see the lamp stretching down the street in a luminous ribbon. But tonight, when he lifted his gaze, he saw only shadows layered upon shadows, blurred by fog. He dipped his brush into a mix of pale ochre and white, attempting to paint the soft glow of a lamppost he could just barely make out through the haze. But the color on the canvas turned dull almost instantly, as if the dimness of the night had seeped into the paint. Julian frowned, leaning closer. "That's not right," he whispered. "It should shine just a little." He wiped the brush on a cloth and stepped back. The half-finished painting depicted a foggy London street, but even his rendering looked darker than he intended. The lamplight he had tried to capture seemed extinguished before the paint finished drying. His lamp, propped on a nearby crate, flickered weakly. Its flame quivered like a thread on the verge of snapping. Julian sighed and stretched his cold fingers. He was used to December chills, but tonight's cold felt different. It clung to him, slipped beneath his sleeves, settled into the bones of the building itself. A soft knock sounded on the attic door. Eliza studied the work, her expression thoughtful. Maybe it's the night trying to tell us something. Julian gave a faint laugh. You speak like mother. Not the usual sputter of a weak flame, but a slow, deliberate pulse, brightening, dimming, brightening again, almost like a signal. The lamppost pulsed once more, then went dark completely, vanishing into the fog as if erased. Watched what? Everything, Elliot whispered. Behind her, the lantern pulsed once more, dimming the room even further. The children drew closer together, small breaths fogging the cold air. Mrs. Dorchester turned toward them, her expression calm, but her bones trembling with the weight of something unspoken. Tonight, even Lantern Hollow, the village, once famous for holding the warmest glow, felt the creeping chill of a darkness that spread with intention. And whatever stood at the boundaries of the hollow was no ordinary child. On the southern bank of the Thames, where the river widened into a slow mist-covered stretch, the district known as Bishop's Wharf had always been a haven of hard-working fishermen and boat builders. Lanterns usually lined the docks through the night, guiding late-arriving barges and keeping the shoreline visible even in the coldest months. But tonight, Bishop's Wharf was swallowed whole, not just dimmed, not merely fogged, but plunged into a deep, unnatural blackout, as though someone had draped a heavy curtain over the entire waterfront. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the river, muted, sluggish, its rhythm altered by the strange stillness in the air. Clara Whitstone, whose family owned a small boat shed near the water's edge, stood outside with her coat pulled tight around her, her breath curled into the darkness like pale smoke. The lantern she held flickered weakly, barely illuminating her boots. She swept the dim beam across the docks. Nothing. The lamps that usually glowed in steady rows were dead. Every single one. No light at all, she whispered. But not even a glimmer. Her father, Edgar Whitstone, stepped out behind her, rubbing his gloved hands for warmth. He was a broad man with lines etched into his face from years spent repairing skiffs and river punts. "Never seen the Wolf go fully dark," he said, squinting toward the fog-shrouded river. "Even during storms, there's always a few lamps holding on." Clara turned slowly. "Do you think the gas lines failed?" "Can't be all of them," Edgar muttered. "And the fires at the forge barely lit tonight. Something's choking the light itself." As he stepped further out onto the dock, the boards beneath him creaked in the cold. The river beyond was black, so black it seemed bottomless. Clara followed, her lantern offering no real comfort. She could barely see her father even a few feet ahead. A faint splash rippled somewhere out on the water. Clara froze. What was that? "Fish jumping," Edgar replied out of habit, but his voice lacked conviction. Another ripple, then another, except these weren't random splashes. They came in a slow, rhythmic pattern, almost like footsteps on water. Edgar raised his head, listening, his breath held in his chest. The pattern continued. Tap, 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 as if something lightly touched the river's surface, drawing closer. Clara lifted her lantern higher. "Father, something's moving." Fog swirled across the river, shifting in graceful waves. A cold breeze drifted past, brushing Clara's hair, carrying with it a faint scent of frost and something else, something metallic. Edgar moved protectively in front of her. "Back to the sheds," he said quietly. "Now." But before they could turn, a soft glow, so faint it could have been imagined, appeared near the center of the river. A tiny pinprick of light. Clara gasped. "A lantern." "No," Edgar whispered. "Too small." The speck hovered just above the water, pulsating gently. Once, twice, 3 times, then it vanished. The river went silent again. Clara's lantern guttered violently, shrinking into a trembling bead of gold. For a moment, she feared it would die like the others. She cuped her hand around it, coaxing the flame. Behind them, a door opened somewhere along the wharf. and a few neighbors emerged, holding their own dimming lanterns. Their silhouettes wavered in the darkness like drifting shadows. "Everything's gone out," someone called. "All the lamps. The whole war's dark." Edgar placed a steadying hand on Clarara's shoulder. "We're heading inside," he said. "Lock the doors. Stay close to the hearth. This fog, this night, it's different." As they stepped back toward the boat, Clarara glanced once more over her shoulder. The river was still, the dark was heavy, the air thrummed with an uneasy quiet. Something had passed along the Thames tonight, something that dimmed more than lamps, and Bishop's Wharf could feel the echo of it lingering in the cold. On the quieter side of Seven Bells Court, tucked between a print shop and an old perfumery, sat a narrow brick building with a crooked sign that read, "Miss Lenton's Fine Stitchery." The shop had belonged to Miss Arabella Lenton for nearly 30 years. Her hands were famous. Across half of London, nimble, gentle, capable of stitching velvets so perfectly that seams vanished like illusions. Her shop was normally a haven of soft lamplight and colorful fabrics, but tonight it lay draped in the same heavy dimness that had overtaken the city. Inside, Miss Lenton worked late at her sewing table, bent over a luxurious cloak meant for a holiday ball. A small oil lamp flickered beside her, its flame wavering so faintly that she had to lean inches from her fabric to see her needle. She sighed softly. "Come now," she murmured to the flame. "Don't give up yet. I'm nearly finished." But the lamp only shivered in answer. She drew her needle through thick velvet, but something caught her eye. The thread, normally a bright silver, looked dull, almost gray, as if the color itself had been leached away. She squinted, held it closer to the lamp. No change. Arabella blinked in confusion. This thread was shimmering not an hour ago. She tugged gently on it. The needle glided through the fabric as usual, but the dullness disturbed her. She reached for a spool of gold thread as comparison, but when she held it toward the lamp, it too appeared muted, nearly colorless. Her heart ticked faster. At that moment, a soft tapping sounded at the front window. Arabella nearly dropped her needle. She rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron as she approached the shop's entrance. The street outside was swallowed in heavy fog, and she could barely make out the shapes of the buildings opposite her. Tap, tap, tap. She lifted the lantern from its hook beside the door and held it toward the window. Its weak glow barely reached the glass. "Who's out there?" she called gently. "Is someone in need?" No answer, just the fog pressing close. She took another step and froze, because as her lantern shifted in her hand, she caught sight of something faint, almost invisible in the corner of the window. A single smudge, a streak as if a fingertip had dragged across the condensation, but the shape was odd. Not quite a fingerprint, not quite human. Arabella leaned closer. The marks seemed to shimmer faintly, then fade before her eyes, as though the glass itself swallowed it. She stepped back sharply, breathing. "This night grows stranger by the minute," she whispered. She locked the door, sliding the bolt with a soft click, and returned to her sewing table, if only to anchor herself in something familiar. But as she sat down, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The silver thread she'd been using was unraveling, not from her stitches, not from the spool, but unraveling in place, fraying itself quietly, fiber by fiber, as though the darkness tugged at it with tiny, unseen fingers. Arabella's breath hitched. "No, no, that's impossible." She reached out to touch it. The moment her fingertip brushed the thread, the lamp dimmed sharply, and the frayed ends of the silver filament seemed to quiver. For a heartbeat, the room felt colder. The shadows leaned closer, and the fog outside the window thickened like breath gathering on glass. Arabella pulled her hand back, heart pounding. She closed her sewing kit, extinguished the trembling lamp, and lit a single candle, even though its flame was barely a whisper. Tonight, even her craft, so steady, so reliable, felt altered, as though the darkness had learned to tug on threads, and in 7B Bell's Court, the seamstress stitched quietly in the dim light, the fabric on her table trembling ever so faintly, as if aware of the night closing in around it. In the bustling heart of Fleet Street, dawn normally arrived not with sunlight but with sound. The clatter of printing presses, the shuffle of newsboys, the slam of inked plates being loaded again and again as fresh headlines rushed toward the waking city. But on this peculiar December morning, the Morning Clarion office sat in an uneasy half-dark, its lamps barely flickering, its windows covered in a fog so dense it turned the entire newsroom into a shadowed cavern. Inside, Mr. Lawrence Hobb, senior editor, stood before the printing machine with ink-stained sleeves and a face marked by exhaustion. He had arrived before dawn, as always, expecting to find the press already churning. Instead, he found silence. He paced toward the nearest desk, leaning over a stack of draft reports. One article mentioned failing gas lamps. Another described flickering hearths. A third, scribbled hastily by a reporter who hadn't returned, spoke of strange figures watching from the fog. Lawrence swallowed hard. He turned to Peter. "Fetch a small lamp. We'll draft something. The Clarion prints, no matter the hour." Peter hurried off, returning with a trembling light that barely illuminated the desk. Lawrence dipped his pen in ink, but the ink was thin. The tip of the pen skated uncertainly across the page. The letters appeared faint, ghost-like, so pale he had to squint to read them. "The ink isn't taking," he murmured. He dipped again, pressed harder. The words remained colorless, as though the darkness drained the pigment before it touched the paper. Peter watched wide-eyed. "Sir, is it the ink?" Lawrence touched the ink pot. It felt cold, too cold. Then something caught his attention. Blank at first, completely blank. But as he approached, shapes began to form. A faint gray outline, as though sketched by invisible hands. God help us, he breathed. Something has taken the light. Atop Delgy Hill, where the great dome of St. Paul's rose like a guardian above the city, the fog pressed tightly against the stone walls, muffling every sound. Inside the bell tower, Beatrice Langford, an assistant bell ringer, stood wrapped in her wool coat as she monitored the ropes that controlled the smaller morning bells. She had expected sunrise by now, expected light to filter through the windows and brighten the tower's dim interior, but the world outside was still dark, a heavy velvety dark that settled across the city like a second skin. Beatrice rubbed her gloved hands together and leaned close to the small lantern placed at her feet. Its flame was frail, so faint it struggled simply to exist. "This won't do," she whispered. "We have morning prayers soon." She lifted the lantern toward one of the narrow tower windows. The flame quivered in the cold, casting just enough glow to reveal the view beyond. Ludgate Hill was swallowed in a gray mist. The streets below, normally busy even at dawn, lay still. The lamps glowed like dying embers. The sky, usually paling toward blue, remained a uniform charcoal. He lifted the lantern nearer. Easy now, easy. The flame inside trembled, then shrank, almost as though something nearby drew the light inward. A sudden metallic clang echoed from the far end of the yard where the iron gate opened onto the quiet Kensington street. Joseph froze. The horses reacted instantly, snorting, backing away, stamping in agitation. He steadied himself and called out, "Hello," but his voice felt swallowed by the fog. "Hello," he managed again. But even he didn't expect an answer. By this hour, the milkman's cart would clatter over the cobblestones, bottles softly chiming in their wooden crates as residents cracked open their doors to greet the new day. His horse, Bennett, shifted nervously, breath rising in pale bursts that vanished far too quickly, as though the air itself swallowed warmth before it fully formed. But hanging oddly, suspended, lingering far longer than it should, as if the cold had thickened into something with weight. He waved his hand through the white haze. It barely stirred. "Now that ain't natural," he whispered. Bennett snorted sharply and stamped a hoof, refusing to take another step into the mews. The fog pulled thickest there, drifting in slow, deliberate curls. It looked less like weather and more like something settling, choosing its place carefully. But even there the beat was distant, soft, as if he were listening through a thick wall. Mrs. Crowther tilted her head. Is something the matter? He forced a calm smile. I'm just noticing a bit of irregularity. Likely the cold. Let me prepare you some tonic. But as he walked away, his hands trembled. He steadied himself on the counter, breath shaking. Then he noticed something else. On the wall across from him, the framed barometer, always reliable, registered no pressure at all. The needle hovered at the very bottom, as if the air itself had thinned beyond measurement. The lanterns in their hands gave off weak halos, barely enough to illuminate their boots. Even the trees behind them stood like silhouettes carved from ink. From the base of the hill, more voices carried faintly upward. People stepping outside, confused murmurs blending with the stillness. One man pointed upward. "Look!" The crowd turned. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just the heavy dim sky, the fog drifting like pale smoke. But then they noticed it. A faint glow high above the horizon, a thread of light thin as a single stroke of paint. It wavered weakly, as if struggling to take hold. Mrs. Elmwood gasped softly. The sun, but the glow didn't strengthen, didn't widen, didn't warm the air. Instead, it flickered slowly like a failing ember, then faded again, swallowed whole by the heavy gray. Mr. Hawthorne lowered his telescope with trembling fingers. "The sun is trying," he whispered, "but something is smothering it." A heavy quiet fell over the hill. Even the fog seemed to pause. Children clung to their parents' arms. Men removed their hats instinctively, as though standing before something sacred and terrifying. Finally, a boy's voice broke the silence. "Sir, does that mean it won't come up at all?" Hawthorne didn't speak at first. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. His breath left his chest in a slow, trembling sigh. "I do not know," he said, "but the world is colder than it should be." And light, he looked at his dim lantern. Light is no longer behaving. The residents slowly descended the hill, lanterns trembling in their hands, their shadows stretching strangely long behind them, even without sunlight. No one noticed the final detail until the last of them turned away. The faint thread of glow on the horizon tried once more to form a sunrise. But this time, instead of brightening, it dimmed down, 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 until the sky turned darker than before, as though something vast and quiet had simply pressed its hand over the sun. Tonight had not ended, dawn had not arrived, London was caught in the in-between, and the city understood with a slow, dawning dread. The darkness was no longer passing through, it was staying. Across all of London, from the trembling lamps of Whitechapel to the silent wharves along the Thames, the city had surrendered to a darkness that refused to lift. No dawn had broken, no warmth had returned. Every hearth, every lantern, every candle quivered like a fading heartbeat. And at the center of the city, in a modest townhouse tucked along Rosemary Street, Dr. Martin Evely, the historian who had received the mysterious letter, sat beneath the dimmest of lights, the sealed envelope still on his desk. He hadn't slept, not since reading the message hours earlier. Now, as the fog pressed against his windows, he unfolded the letter again, hands trembling slightly. It contained only one sentence, one chilling line scrawled in ink that seemed darker than the ink his own pens produced. "Prepare yourself, for this darkness has a name." He had spent the long, sleepless hours searching through his archives, dragging dusty books from shelves, flipping through aged manuscripts, and lighting candle after candle, each flame weakening as soon as it touched the air. And at last he found it. An obscure reference in an old Nordic chronicle nearly forgotten. A brief passage describing a winter so deep, so unnaturally still, it extinguished fire, smothered sound, and quieted the pulses of the living. The phenomenon was called the long dim. Not night, not storm, not spell, a presence, a season that fell only once in recorded memory and lingered for 9 days. Dr. Everly read the passage again slowly, heart hammering. When the long dim falls, it does not descend from sky, nor rise from earth, but spreads from the folds between shadow and breath. Fire flees it, sound quiets before it, and the living feel their warmth drawn gently away. Only unity among lights, many flames held close, may keep the dark from learning their names. He stared at the last line, he whispered it aloud. Many flames held close, his eyes widened. Teachers still gathered in schools, families huddled in single rooms. Choirs whispered nervously in halls, watchmen patrolled with weak lanterns, children clung together in Lantern Hollow. Without knowing why, the entire city had done what the ancient text advised. They had stayed together, but a deeper question lingered. If this was truly the long dim, how long before the darkness learned the city's name? Suddenly, a soft knock echoed through the quiet house. Then another, slow, measured, as if the darkness itself had rapped on the door. Dr. Everly rose cautiously. "Who's there?" he called. Silence. He lifted his lantern. The flame pulsed once, weakly, then steadied. He opened the door, only a crack. Outside, the fog billowed gently, thick and patient. A faint ripple moved through it, like something brushing the air before slipping out of sight. Then he noticed them. Lanterns, hundreds of them, dim and trembling, held by neighbors up and down the street. Men, women, children, cold, frightened, exhausted, but standing together. Mrs. Thorne, from Bishopsgate Constable Hollowell, from Charing Cross Julian the painter, Mrs. Dorchester from Lantern Hollow, the O'Connells from Eastcheap the baker, Tobias Finch, Miss Lenton with her trembling thread father, Elias and his choir children, even the horses tied safely behind the crowd stood calmer in their shared glow. They had gathered without warning, without messages, without calls. London had simply come to itself. The lantern light shimmered across faces, pale with worry, but bright with determination. A mosaic of tiny flames fighting the darkness together. Dr. Everly stepped outside, lantern held high. "It has a name," he said softly, to those nearest. "This darkness, and it listens, it watches. But the old texts say that light, many lights held together, can keep it at bay." A murmur carried through the crowd, fear and hope intertwining. In response, something shifted in the fog, a soft recoil, a quiet withdrawing, as if the long dim recognized it had been challenged. People lifted their lanterns higher. The flames flickered, hesitated, then almost miraculously brightened just a little. A fragile shimmer, but brighter than before. The faint glows spread, reflecting off windows, brushing rooftops, touching the fog with thin threads of gold. The long dim did not depart. It waited still, but it waited at a distance, and for the first time since the darkness began, London exhaled as one. The night was not over. The dawn had not come, but the city had found its answer. With trembling hands and steadfast hearts, they stood shoulder to shoulder, holding their lanterns together against a darkness older than memory. And in that fragile circle of light, London endured. As the city of 1877 held its breath beneath the weight of the long dim, so too may you allow your own breath to soften, slow, and settle. Thank you for joining this journey through fog and quiet streets, through dimming lanterns and silent hearths, through a city that learned the strength of standing together. Wherever you are listening from tonight, the US, Europe, Asia, Australia, Africa, or anywhere in the world, I am grateful for your presence here. If your eyes are growing heavy now, if your breath has fallen into a gentler rhythm, let the last whispers of this story cradle you. Know that even in the deepest fog, even when the dawn delays its coming, A single warm light held close can guide you through the quiet. Thank you for watching, for dreaming with me, and for being part of this peaceful moment. Rest well, and let sleep take you softly. Good night.